Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first talk of the incident response stream here on day one, AUSCERT2025. Our next speaker is Dylan Jones. Dylan's the chief. Yeah, Dylan. Give it a round for applause for Dylan. Come on up, Dylan. Dylan, you can tell everyone that you're the chief security architect from Leidos, from Brisbane. So, are you mic'd up?
I am. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Dave. Hello, everybody. Very bright in here. I kind of feel like Donald Trump yelling at the cloud, turn the lights off, but that's all right. When I was and for the record, I'm a chronic pacer. And so you'll see me walking up and down here, rambling like a madman. But I was putting together a submission here for AUSCERT. And I was wondering what would be well received. And I thought about doing an advanced level 1 on steganography and how we can exfiltrate information through images. But then I thought to myself, all of the things that I have done throughout my career have led me to one particular location. And that's, let's get the basic shit right. Let's get the fundamentals of what we're doing and the fundamentals of incident response down pat. And so this presentation is not going to be teaching you some brand new tactic that was discovered yesterday and, there's some really deep, detailed research. But what I'm hoping you will take from this are some building blocks and some foundations that you can use in your organization today, you can implement for your customers, and honestly, just something that you can leverage to boost your own security maturity. I can almost rhyme. And so with that, who am I? It depends on who you ask. If you ask my friends, I'm a degenerate with a keyboard. If you ask my boss, I'm probably the biggest pain in his ass. But for me, I've dabbled in the cybers for the better part of my career, and I've loved every minute of it. So much so that I made a passing comment in Grant's tutorial on Tuesday where I said, I've got 3 loves in life: incident response, Dua Lipa, and my wife, in that exact order. And you can imagine how that went down when I told my wife. And so she challenges me to try and marry Dua Lipa, but that's another story. But most importantly, I'm on a lifelong quest to get slightly less bad at things. And so through this presentation, I'm going to share some of the things that I have learnt. That one up there, the picture with me drinking all of the V and Red Bull, that was at about 11 o'clock before evicting a Chinese nation state out of a customer's environment overseas. Me eating popcorn was 12 hours later at about 11 a.m. after rebuilding 52 domain controllers. Kind of boring work, but someone's got to do it. For every action, there is an unequal and moderately insufficient opposite reaction. Isn't that Newton's third? No. Newton's third law, which is everything has an opposite reaction or everything has a reaction, the same thing can be said about your security practice today, right? How do you handle a security incident when it occurs? And it will occur, mark my words. And as to quote a former FBI director, there are 2 types of organizations in this world: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they have been. And it's very, very true. And it's probably a really good segue into talking about what threat actors are, right? So again, a little crash course on who's targeting you and why it is important. So the first one we've got, state-sponsored. So state-sponsored threat actors, think of countries like China, Russia, different facets of a nation state. They have different capabilities. So for example, there's Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army in China, and they're the military arm that are charged with offensive cyber operations against organizations like yours. But then you've got the lesser known, but still equally powerful, Ministry of State Security as an example, right? And they're the civilians, and the analogy that I like to use is, imagine ASIO and ASIS have a love child. That is what they do. They're civilians and they're charged with protecting the mothership. I should also preface this by saying I have a bit of a potty mouth, so if you're easily offended, I'm not sorry. Cyber criminals, they would sell their fucking grandmother for $1 if they could. They just want to go out and make the quickest dollar that they can, through any means necessary. They will ransom you, they'll do the double ransom, so they'll throw down ransomware, and they will turn around and then exfiltrate your data and then ransom you again once you've paid the ransom, because people don't pay your ransom, because they could. And then you've got the annoying group of people, which are the activists. And don't worry, there's like a catch-all at the bottom, so this isn't, the gospel, the only three groups. But activists are people that are politically and ideologically motivated to achieve their actions. It's the equivalent of those dicks that you see on Story Bridge gluing themselves to the bridge, as an example. Activists, or hacktivists as they're also referred to, they've got no problems defacing websites, launching denial of service attacks, doing anything in support of their cause. And then there's the catch-all, which is like everything else, and of course, things change. So and if we were to look at, say, nation states or state-sponsored threat actors, they've got three core objectives when they're compromising an environment, when they've got a target. So these are technological objectives. These aren't what are their objectives as a unit within the government, as an example. They've got obtain access, maintain access to your environment through any means necessary, and exfiltrate information. Exfiltrate your trade secrets, exfiltrate the financial data of your organisation, whatever they can do to go out and collect and take that information, they will. So there's a prime example. I'm not sure if anybody here listens to Nicole Perlroth, who I argue is probably up there in the top 3 investigative journalists of our time. She was telling a story recently about how an organisation believed to be in support of China were caught hacking or caught inside an environment of a solar panel manufacturer. And why that is important is because 18 months later, you saw that China was pumping out all of these incredible solar panels and undercutting the rest of the world. So it doesn't matter if you're a mum and pop shop, it doesn't matter if you're a large bank and you've got trillions of dollars in assets, they couldn't give a shit, right? They care about your IP and whatever they can get their hands on in support of their own objectives. So I'll share a little bit of a story. Now, this story, it is really hard to condense a 9-month incident response into 36 minutes and 39 seconds that I've got remaining. And so I took the highlights of this particular incident response. And what you'll see is there is nothing spectacular, there is nothing mind-blowingly new to this incident that I responded to and I investigated and helped this organisation recover from. But the thing that this organisation had to deal with is one that every organisation, every business that you work with, that you work for, that you run, experience on a daily. So this particular organisation overseas, now everything that I'm about to present is technically correct. I have obscured a couple of details for the sake of privacy. CVE 2019-0604. That was a 9.8 critical rated vulnerability specific to SharePoint servers. Now, if you can tell where I'm going with this, there is nothing new about using an exploit that had been around for over a year at the time of this incident response to compromise this large multinational organisation. Once they got in and they managed to establish their bulkhead or their campsite or their persistence in technical terms, they used web shells for days, as in 7 unique web shells. They created a lone local administrator account on each of the SharePoint web front ends that were in their DMZ. And because it was in the DMZ, that shit's secure, right? not when you domain join your SharePoint web front ends and then put them in your DMZ. It don't work like that. So they established their persistence. Now this is cut down, right? I'm cutting a literal 9-month story into a couple of bullet points. When they were in, they did reconnaissance, data collection. They were caught basically compiling their own binaries within this customer's environment. But most importantly, as soon as they were able to launch a shell and get remote access to these SharePoint web front ends, they started dumping memory and do what every respectable nation state does, and opens up a mimikatz.exe, and yes, it's 2025 and I'm still talking about it because it's still a tool and it's still used and I still see it out in the wild. And they were using that to dump creds. And this organization had, and it pains me to say because they were good people, the worst credential hygiene that I have seen in my 10-year career of looking at credentials, basically. Horrendous. Domain admins logged on to web front ends in a DMZ. Now, where it gets interesting, so cutting a couple of months down the track, where it gets interesting is I saw these WMI pings going out from a bunch of machines. What they were doing is indexing basically all the machines in this environment and then looking at what type of CPU architecture they had and whether or not para-virtualization was enabled, if it was a virtual machine, as an example. And what I identified through this compromise was a bring your own hypervisor scenario. Show of hands in the room if you've heard of a hypervisor called QEMU. Holy shit, that's more than I was thinking. They brought QEMU into the pizza boxes because they were looking for physical machines and installed that. Now, for context, for those that don't know what QEMU is, it is an extremely lightweight hypervisor that allows you to spin up VMs like that. And when I say lightweight, 153 megabytes in size is all this hypervisor was. And with that, they then started bringing in parted files when assembled with the QCOW2 file or the hard drive so that they could start up the VM and they've got their own infrastructure running within the customer's infrastructure. That part was really, really cool because I was about to, I found some bad security things and I thought, I'm just going to pull this string because as far as I'm aware, we're in an enterprise here and I shouldn't see QCOW2 as a file type running in the environment. What the adversary did, they used that as their campground, and there were a number of these staged across the environment. They were using that to establish reverse tunnels back to the mothership, and when I say the mothership, I mean a hosting provider based here in Brisbane, of all places, and I shouldn't say here because we're on the Goldie, but in Brisbane, and they were using that and connecting to that from their own infrastructure from the mothership, which we suspected was China. And so they went out and they started collecting all of this amazing information, a trove of data, financial, IP, things that they could sell on the darknet, so credentials. And one of the things that struck me, and I was going to share this in a little bit, was around how they managed to get so much data into a hard drive, or a VM file effectively, that was less than 10 gigs. And they were using, and again, nothing shocking here, system native binaries. And they created a little PowerShell script, which I may or may not still use to this day when performing red team activities because it was an awesome script. It managed to compress 70 gigabytes of Cosmos DB data, which for those that don't know is JSON format, or basically files of text, 70 gig down to 2 gigabytes using .NET libraries and a PowerShell script. So it's like a nation state versus a dude with PowerShell, basically. And then they took it and ran. So that is a very, very high level, and that's the real impact that nation states, cyber criminals, and anybody who wants to make $1 and sell their grandma will go to. So let's take a step sideways, right? You've heard the cool story and more than happy to share and provide anecdotes as we continue. Have a think. As a security analyst, as a leader, as an executive, do we have any board members in the room? Put your hands up if you're a board member. No, I didn't think so. However, when did the incident occur? So these are the questions that your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss will ask you in the event of an incident. When did it start? When did it occur? Right? So did it occur 6 months ago and we're only now learning about it because our EDR provider decided to up their detection capability? Did our internal detection engineering team decide to go out and create a detection for something that some dude read on a Medium page, like on Thursday night after a few bottles of gin? That has actually happened. What was the impact? Your boss is going to ask you what the impact was. And most importantly, was any data exfiltrated? How did the incident occur, right? Can you answer the basic question of, well, how did this happen? And it's like there's, everything's on fire, you're on fire, and you're that dog saying, no, everything's okay, right? Where did the attack originate? Now, some people go, well, do I really care whereabouts an attack originates if I'm in the middle of an incident? And it can tell you a lot about A, the context of your organization, and B, what they might be targeting, what a threat actor might be looking for inside of your environment. And the question that is extremely hard, and not even some of the largest IR players do this, but who done it? Who did it? Right? Who attacked us? Why did they do it? What did they want? Attribution is a fundamentally difficult task to undertake. And it's not something, having worked for large vendors myself, 2 of the largest security ones, it's not something that they do lightly. And so if you get a SentinelOne, a Microsoft, a CrowdStrike, even the ACSC coming out and go, hey, this activity is linked to Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army, you bet something that it was definitely them. I realise I'm being recorded and have to be a little bit more politically correct than I would normally be. So where does that leave us? The ABCs. Who recognises that picture? Show of hands for my fellow, oh yes, I'm glad I'm not the only one. Maybe showing my youngish age. I was like the one of the 6 people that put their hands up when they asked who were under 32. The ABCs of incident response. Accounts, backdoors, C2 or communication channels, devices that have been compromised, and exfiltration of data, of information, of secrets, whatever it is. In an incident, in a time of crisis, knowing the ABCs and knowing how to do your ABCs will save your ass. And I'm not saying that this is the only methodology. I'm not saying that this is the only way to perform an incident response. But depending on the type of response you're doing will dictate how reactive you are. For example, Jess, the keynote speaker, gave a really good example of organisations getting absolutely pantsed with ransomware. How you respond to that is going to be significantly different to a nation-state intrusion, where time might not be of the absolute essence, but you still want to get them out of your environment, And so I'm going to take you through and give you some pointers, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat. And when I say a little bit of a chat, I'm just going to talk at you for the next 25 minutes and 34 seconds about things that you can do today, now. I see you on your laptop looking at your alerts. What you can do to start supplementing your existing security operations capability. So, what accounts were used for initial access or initial compromise, right? This is important because you need to know where to start. So if you've got an alert and you're trying to figure out what happened, start documenting this. Documentation should have probably been D instead of devices, but I'll let it slide, right? As a SecOps or an incident responder, you want to know, was credential harvesting identified, right? What's the risk that these guys weren't just being opportunistic and they're actually looking to move laterally across my environment? Were any accounts used for subsequent lateral movement, right? What did they do when they moved? Who here has a list, maybe hide your badges, who here has a list of high-value targets within their organization? Be it servers, workstations, people. Awesome, amazing to see. For those that didn't raise their hand, have a little think about who within your organization is going to be the target for when this kind of activity happens. Start to map them out in a secure way. Understand what their functions are. So these are real fundamental tasks that will help you. Because if you notice that there's all of these random alerts popping up for people in our finance department, that could tell you that maybe we're looking at somebody who's interested in making $1 or $2. Maybe they couldn't sell their grandma, they didn't have one, whatever it might be. And as always, won't somebody please think of the cloud? I have too often, I'm tired, man. I'm tired of talking about it, but the cloud is an access point. So it's all well and good when we talk accounts to talk about an AD account that I can sit in front of and log into, but nobody thinks about certificates, or maybe some people do. Maybe I'm just being too rude. Certificates, right? What certificates? SSLs that you've got there, code signing certs. What about your API keys? Do you have an API gateway sitting in your environment for internal data that anybody within the org can use? What about things like app registrations? Highly privileged app registrations. There was an amazing debate that happened on LinkedIn a few days, well, about a week or two ago now, around whether or not you should have a break glass account and a break glass app registration. And I'll be the dude that sits out the front after this and goes, I will debate you about anything, come and fight me, and we can have that chat. Backdoors. What persistence mechanisms did you identify? Right? As part of your incident and going through your incident response journey and through the playbooks that I hope you have when responding to an incident where everything's on fire, what did you identify? Was it a scheduled task? Was it a registry, so an auto run that starts every time your machine starts? Was it an app registration in the cloud, because that is very much a thing? Or was it a misconfiguration and someone just decided to leave 3389 open from external to your organization through to your domain controller, which I literally have seen, and I cried a little bit, right? And if you've got the capability or you partner with a security organization, do an analysis of any implants or backdoors that you find if you aren't capable of doing that yourselves or you don't have the manpower or the effort, right? Because it can tell you a significant amount about your environment. So it brings us to command and control, right? C2. What was detected? What are the C2 channels being used? So when we say what type of C2, we could be talking about a DNS command and control infrastructure. We could be talking about reverse shell, reverse proxy. What type was it? Whereabouts within your environment did you find it? How were they communicating? And when I say how were they communicating, I'm talking about what were they using it for, depending on where you found it. Was it a random IP address? Was it a domain that is very clearly generated with a domain generating algorithm, which is like 4,227 characters long, .xyz, because that's very, very cheap, right? And what's the prevalence of any indicators that you find? Any communication indicators? So when I talk about prevalence, And I will go into how to sort of do this cheaply. What does VirusTotal say? Just Google it, literally VT it, right? What tooling do you have in your environment to be able to at least look at the prevalence of what you've identified as suspicious? It might not be malicious, but it might be suspicious. How many times did you find it? If you found it and it was a low count, well, I mean, that's probably going to ring alarm bells for me personally, right? And what you want to do is automate the investigation. Like I talk about in one of my laws of incident response, which I'll go into, AI, right? Very conscious that I'm being recorded, but if you or your executive, if you are an executive, think that you can replace your human analyst with some AI agentic thing that your vendor's jamming down your throat, fucked. Use it to supplement your human workforce. Because your human workforce, and I'm almost jumping 17 slides ahead, your human workforce are the ones that are going to be able to go out and provide the context to what we found. So automate the hunt for things that you're suspicious of, for things that we know are bad. AUSCERT have an incredible feed. Use it as an example, right? Which brings us to Communist Kitty, the devices. And they're no longer your devices, they're our devices, right? When a device has been compromised, it is extremely difficult. It's not impossible, clearly. You could just nuke it if you didn't care about what's on it. It is very hard to get rid of persistence, right? What you want to do in an incident, and I've done this more times than I care to admit, identify patient 0, right? Where did this infection start? How did this compromise begin? What device, be it a server or a workstation or a mobile phone, you know, your board member's iPad, whatever. Where did this begin? Identify it, because that will provide you a trove of information, hopefully, because, you know, we all log things and we all have good retention policies, don't we? And I'm not seeing any nods, which means you probably all need to go and collectively talk about upping your retention, but that's not the topic of this conversation. How was the device compromised? Was it that Bob from Networks doesn't know how to network and 3389'd externally to your domain controller? Was it that, I don't know, a vulnerability like the SharePoint one was executed? Did somebody literally just walk in with accurate credentials because it's 2025 and we don't do MFA? Also a thing, right? And so understanding how your device or how the devices on the incident that you're responding to were compromised will tell you how you need to react and how you need to respond to the incident. Now remember, the ABCs, and we're at D so far, it's all about going through and trying to identify ways that you can supplement your existing SecOps practices. So you can go and put these things in and answer these questions in support of the bigger questions that we spoke about. Who here has, and show of hands, a containment strategy for destructive attacks when they occur? Pretty eye-opening. I see 3 hands, 4 hands, right? And so that, I don't mean to call people out on that, but how are you going to handle the ransomware incident when it occurs? Even if it's not ransomware, how are you going to handle a rogue employee being a dick? A highly privileged employee who decides that he doesn't stand for what you operate for as an organization and decides to go out and delete your files and start locking people out. I've had people go in and delete full OUs of accounts because the person, the insider threat, knew that the backups wouldn't work. They didn't have the recycling bin enabled. And so it's hard to come back from that. Again, not impossible, but you think about in that context how heavily integrated something like Active Directory is within everything that we do, even as a cloud-first organization. make sure that you're at least thinking about these things. And the reason that I pick on containment strategies for destructive attacks is because time and time again, I've responded to, and this is no exaggeration, probably in excess of about 40 or 50 destructive attacks, both insider threat and ransomware. And everything that those attacks had in common came down to having no plan, which we will talk about, right? And so I can't emphasize that enough. And I hope the people that didn't raise their hands are maybe going and jotting down the questions that they need to go back and ask. And have a business application impact map. Who here has heard of that? Or who has heard of it in a different variation? Awesome. I love that. And here I was thinking that's the one that people weren't going to raise their hand to. I am very, very bad at graphics. I'm not a very graphical person. But I wanted to give an example of what it might look like if you've got no people, no money, no budget, no capability, you're really shit at anything to do with Visio, just do it in PowerPoint. But the concept here is to map out if something happens, let's see if I can break the system. Hey, there we go. If something happens to, as an example, a SQL database cluster, what does that mean? What are the downstream effects to whatever activity that knocks out SQL in a destructive attack scenario? You might not be able to log into your payroll system or your finance system, which means your people aren't getting paid. And I can tell you free of charge, even though we've probably paid to be here, that in a crisis situation, you don't want your people walking out of the room because you can't pay them. Us humans, we've got bills to pay, mortgages to pay, small humans to feed. But the concept of what I'm trying to demonstrate is the knock-on effect to destructive attacks and how difficult they can become to investigate and how difficult they are to recover from. And so to put it into perspective, during COVID, I did a ransomware that knocked out about 12 hospitals. And that's everybody from, the mum not being able to receive her cancer treatment because the oncology ward was completely shut down and they didn't know the dosage of how much chemo to give her, which is something that hits close to home for me, having a family member going through exactly that here. However, you then look at it and go, well, if they had a plan, maybe they could have isolated it a little bit more. But to bring the human factor back into it, what about Bob, who was getting his, cataracts or his laser eye surgery done, and at the exact same incident, the Windows Server 2003 machine that was sitting in the operating room was the one controlling the laser that was pointed at old mate's eye. Think about that and the actual impact to human life on the back of destructive attacks. I'm getting off my high horse now, I promise. So let's talk about data exfiltration, right? We've done the business application map. What are the signs and symptoms of data exfiltration? This is one of the areas that is really difficult to try and, map out, to try and identify, because there are so many different mechanisms and there are so many ways that we as security practitioners can quite frankly masquerade data exfil, right? And so something that I love doing is using that script from the IR that I did like 1,100 years ago and compressing data and then shipping it out via unsavory mechanisms. In the context of a red team where I've got approval, I should have probably, had that little asterisk there. Look at what your network activity is telling you, right? Do you see through your intelligence, because intelligence is everything and context is key for those that might have gone to B-sides last week and heard me talk, having that ability to go in and identify the type of internet traffic while being cognizant of not snooping on your employees. Because there is this misconception that just because we do deep packet inspection and we can see every single bit and byte in clear text within our organization, as a person who works for an organization that has that capability, I think, no, very good, secure citizens, right? And so how will this happen to you? in a number of ways. User clicks a link, a sensitive information leak might occur, right? There will be unintentional or intentional misconfiguration. So again, I'm the disgruntled guy. I'm going to go and set up a point of ingress for when I leave this organization and want to come back in. And I have seen that exact scenario, right? Or again, how will it happen? What is the business reputation if you're a SaaS-based organization? And not to pick on AUSCERT or anything, but as an example, imagine you got an adversary that was had their bee in a bonnet about AUSCERT and started denial of servicing, throwing down what there was one yesterday, 6.4 terabits per second was detected against, I was a journalist, I can't remember who it was. But imagine that, targeting AUSCERT's indicators and their feeds, preventing every single organisation and member in this room from being able to retrieve intelligence to determine whether or not bad shit was happening in their environment, right? So it's got a real human aspect to how this will impact you when it happens. And lastly, I'm going to get onto my 5 laws of investigation. Now, again, this is not gospel, this is just my own observations. If you haven't seen the theme, have a plan for when it happens. Have a communications plan. Have somebody on the other end of 1-800-OH-SHIT. When things go wrong, who are you going to call that can give you the reinforcements you need to recover? Right? Defense evolves through offensive understanding. Know the context of your environment. Know your weak spots and know how and why it is important. Right? Know the fact that Jerry from accounting is against everything and has a Nokia 3310, therefore can't do MFA. Know about that so that you can provide mitigations around SMS spoofing, as an example. Something is better than nothing. And this applies through SecOps in its entirety, but more specifically, it applies to technical teams, right? If you're an organization who's got no money, who's got no budget, but you've got human capital that you can use, why not go use and leverage some open source tooling? Firstly, leverage open source tooling because I'm a massive open source advocate. But B, make sure you contribute back. If you've got time, use it, because having a tool to do the thing is better than having this much visibility. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Kind of, implied, right? However, when we're talking about investigation, just because you don't see the bad thing doesn't mean the bad thing isn't happening, right? I'm not going to draw the something around and find out graph. Understand your weak points and understand how to investigate them. And AI is not a panacea. It is not going to solve every single one of your SecOps problems. And I'm probably going to get cancelled for having this level of an opinion. However, AI, we need to supplement the human factor, the analysts, the executives, the GRC people in the room. Supplement. Don't make them irrelevant, because your humans, your analysts, will provide the context of what is important, why this is important. They understand the context of alerting. They understand what you do as an organization. Use it, but don't let it replace you. And lastly, one of my favorite quotes from Ian Fleming: once is happenstance, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dylan. What a great talk. Here's a little gift from AUSCERT.
Thank you, mate.
And Dylan was around the rest of the week, and he obviously loves a chat. So outside, please do a chat with Dylan, or later tonight at the dinner. Who knows? Thanks Dylan, again. Another round of applause.